Fox News recently put out an article stating that if any Gulf Coast oil-producing state were to be impacted by a major storm system this hurricane season, we'd likely see gas prices skyrocket and hit record highs once again. Now, this should tell you that the most important prep you can get before a storm hits is gas. You need to make sure you have fuel stored up and ready to go in case you need to evacuate or in case you need to run your generator after a power outage. And yet, even if you don't live in a hurricane-affected area, you may want to store up some gas now, because if these prices go as high as they say they will, you might not be able to afford the gas that you have access to after the fact. Now, gas is one of the first things that runs out during a hurricane. Obviously, people need to evacuate, they have generators to run, and there's a lot of reasons why fuel goes quickly. Everybody gets on the same page and they all buy it up. And during Hurricanes Florence and Michael, gas stations reported running out of gas the second the emergency was declared. So understand that getting ahead of the government is going to buy you some time. And you need to store these things now so that you don't get caught off guard when a storm is en route. Now, you can store the gas this second while it's still available, not necessarily cheap, but it's accessible, and that's very important because you might need to leave, you might need to run a generator, and you don't want to have to question whether or not you'll be able to during an emergency disaster. Now, the shelf life on gasoline is 3 to 6 months, and the less ethanol in the gas, the longer it will last. So usually when I store gasoline, I try to do premium gas that has no ethanol in it. It'll give me a little bit more time, and 3 to 6 months is a good amount of time for someone who's in a hurricane-affected environment, because if you buy it right now, you'll be able to ride out hurricane season and have that gas still be shelf stable. So that's something for you to consider. And make sure if you're storing gas, you use proper gasoline storage devices. You want to use gas cans that are rated to actually hold fuel, and you don't want to use things like we saw during the Colonial Pipeline crisis, where people were filling up garbage bags and Rubbermaid containers with gas. Please don't do that. Make sure you have the proper containers in order to maintain a level of safety. Because oddly enough, during a hurricane, when there's tons of rain and water everywhere, fires still happen, and a lot of time it's from improper fuel storage and using things like generators where they shouldn't be used. So keep all of those things in mind. Now, you can purchase fuel stabilizers as well if you want to extend the life of the gasoline and make it last even longer. So if you're buying fuel to store it and you want to have access to fuel that's more affordable now than it might be after a hurricane, I guess, you can use fuel stabilizer and still have that gasoline stored away even if a storm never comes, which is another thing that you might want to look into. The other thing you want to keep in mind is that diesel, if you're running diesel vehicles, can last up to a year and probably even a little bit longer, so you might not have to consider things like stabilizer or anything like that if you're running diesel. So that is something to keep in mind, but at the end of the day, gas is going to be the most important prep you can get now, before a storm hits. People get stuck at gas stations in lines for hours trying to fill their vehicles and trying to fill their gas cans for generators, and then they run out before they even get to the pump. And that is something that you don't want to be caught up in, because if you need to evacuate, you need to just leave. You shouldn't have to be making additional stops if you don't have to. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the government is very mindful of people's behavior during these crises. And what happens is that the government will actually say and put out a PSA letting you know that you should not be filling gas cans or additional containers. You should only be filling your vehicle with the amount of gas you need to get to where you're going, because we have to make sure there's enough for everyone. And so obviously there could be restrictions and rationing and all kinds of other things being put into place if you wait too long. So get fuel now while it's not affordable but accessible, and then have it stored away before a storm hits. Even if you're not in hurricane country, keep it in mind that if a hurricane hits a state like Texas or Louisiana or some of these oil-producing states that are on the Gulf Coast, and it wrecks a bunch of rigs that are offshore, or who knows what else could happen, well, it might affect your prices to the point where you can't afford to store it anymore either. And so having it stored now might buy you a little bit of time, or might save you a little bit of money. I wanted to bring this message out to you, give you something to think about. If you have anything else to add to it, leave it in the comments below. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.